Philosophy, Immanuel Kant, location, truth, elementals. In the series of philosophy, we have done episodes on some philosophers. On Immanuel Kant, we have done 2 episodes from different standpoints. Today, we'll do the 3rd episode on Immanuel Kant. On Kant and Heidegger, we have done more than 1 episodes because the width of concepts, the depth of concepts, and the relationship of these concepts to other concepts in other areas, that is so rich an area that it calls for more than a couple of episodes on both these philosophers, Immanuel Kant and Heidegger. One more element about Immanuel Kant on a personal note. He happens to be one of my favorite philosophers, and therefore more coverage than comparable other philosophers. Today we'll take a look at Immanuel Kant from 3 standpoints: his location in the history of philosophy, his ideas on truth, and his ideas on epistemological elementals. Let us first start with his location in the history of philosophy. He happens to live in the 17th century, which is a very important century from standpoint of history of Western civilization. 17th century is almost like the closure of the Christian era in Europe. The mischief of the missionaries continued across the world and continues even today. But in Europe, the closure of the Christian era was happening in the 17th century. And Immanuel Kant comes right at the closure of this era. And after him comes Nietzsche, who announces aloud what Immanuel Kant said in whispers, almost silently. And that is the search to find a foundation for human morality without reliance on a divine authority. It takes the form of categorical imperative in Immanuel Kant, and it takes the form of God is dead and man is free. A crisis of Himalayan proportions on designing human society, culture, and morality without a divine authority, which comes aloud in Nietzsche. Immanuel Kant also comes at a critical time where the contest between knowability and non-knowability, reliability and non-reliability of knowledge is reaching a crescendo in the Western philosophical world. So in that sense, Immanuel Kant not only stands as a great philosopher of all times, but he comes at a very critical moment in the history of Western philosophy, especially European philosophy, and that is in the closure of the Christian era of European history. And Immanuel Kant grappled with problems of his time, which were at the center of the philosophical discourse. And the problems that he grapples with are these. First is the reliability of knowledge. And he is responding to Hume on the reliability of knowledge. And the reliability of knowledge is established by reliability of tools of knowledge, which is the knowing apparatus that is our mind. So the reliability of knowledge cannot be established by relying on the outside world, which promises us no reliability in any way. So the reliability of knowledge, if at all it has to exist, has to come from the reliability of the apparatus that is generating knowledge, which is the reliability of tools of knowledge. And there is a very important element here. As knowledge multiplies in the human world, two things come up. One, is this knowledge that we have accumulated so much, is it reliable and absolute, or is it transitional and fundamentally promises us no reliability or stability? That is a very important element of the absoluteness of knowledge or the reliability of knowledge. Second element, which is very important for Immanuel Kant and also for philosophy per se, not only in West but also in the East, is what I say and what Professor Bernard Williams, I think, has pointed out very correctly, the problem of saving ourselves. That as science advances, the first thing that happens is the world gets explained away. And as the world gets explained away, divinity is erased. Everything is explained in terms of science, and therefore there is no place for God, divinity, mysticism, or anything miraculous or magical. Everything is explained in terms of very stable, reliable, predictable laws. So when the world gets explained away, God cannot be saved. And in the second step of the march of knowledge, knowledge now turns inwards. From the knowledge of physics, biology, chemistry, we now turn to the knowledge of psychology, and much of what we call ourselves starts getting explained. And as we or parts of us starts getting explained away, we are terrified of being explained away completely as a mechanism. And there is a imperative need to save ourselves from this explaining away movement of knowledge. And that's a dilemma. We want knowledge and we don't want to get explained away by knowledge. We want to save ourselves even as we have knowledge. And it's a difficult desire we have. Much of modern Western philosophy can be said, and this is pointed out by Professor Bernard Williams, can be said I'm getting confused with the name, but there is a professor of philosophy who said this. I hope I'm not making a mistake, but be that as it may, somebody has pointed it out that the two defining movements of contemporary Western philosophy, not only contemporary, but the whole of modern Western philosophy, are this. The first, finding reliability in knowledge by finding reliability in the process of knowing. And second, there is this movement how to save ourselves from getting explained. And therefore, there is a recurrent reaction to the determinism, the systematization, the materialism, the meta-narrativism from foundations of platforms of existentialism, of spiritualism, and also from scholastic philosophy. Very strange that even in scholastic philosophy, in Immanuel Kant, we see this current of trying to save ourselves from this, from getting explained away by science. The fifth important element that Immanuel Kant deals with is the limits of knowledge. And these limits of knowledge are arrived at by Immanuel Kant by understanding the limits of the apparatus that is trying to know, which is to understand the limits of our mind and the limits of the process of knowing. So the limits of the knowing apparatus and the limits of the process of knowing together constitute the limits of human knowledge. These are not limits of knowledge per se, these are limits of human knowledge. One important element in the limits of human knowledge is also the unknowable thing in itself. We'll come to it slightly later. The cardinal moral point that Immanuel Kant deals with is the crisis of belief, the crisis of ethics, the crisis of morality, on what to base our ethical systems on what to base human morality upon. And Immanuel Kant brings up the idea of the categorical imperative, an innate sense of moral sense, an innate sense of ethics. And in practice puts up the principle of scaling up our behavior on a social scale and see if it is still reasonable. So the genesis of morality is put innately as categorical imperative, and the categorical imperative is inborn, innate, without any reference to a divine authority. And this was adequate for Immanuel Kant in his view to continue with society based upon categorical imperative. But Nietzsche was far more practical on this point. And he recognized that the categorical imperative idea is not enough. And in practical sense, we really don't have any foundation for morality after the death of God. And the crisis of belief and the crisis of ethics is of monumental proportions. Use the words of someone else. And Immanuel Kant also finally dealt with the limits of not only science, but also limits of faith. People talk about limits of science, but not of limits of faith. But faith also gets limited in the sense one man's faith is no better or worse than another man's faith, because essentially faith is unintelligible. Because it is not something you know through the classical process of knowledge, the process of knowing that Immanuel Kant puts forward. The process of sensation, perception, conception, knowledge, wisdom. So that is the location of Immanuel Kant in the history of philosophy and what he dealt with. What is Immanuel Kant's take on truth? If by truth we mean the true knowledge about reality, Kant says it is neither completely unknowable nor completely knowable. Truth is partially knowable. The thing in itself cannot be known, but certain aspects of the thing in itself which appear to us as a phenomena in the process of knowing, involving the process of knowing, those things can be. So the thing does exist. What the thing is in itself we cannot know, but we definitely know what it appears as to us, and the appearance is constant. Human knowledge is reliable to the extent that it will be the same for all human beings to come. So the truth is human. So truth is knowable. Truth is not completely knowable. Truth is partially knowable, and the truth is human. Strictly limited to our human mode of knowing. If there is another species and knows something in very different ways, we can't say how they will see reality. So our truth is knowable, partially unknowable, and it is human. But what is known is reliable and stable. And the truths are of two types. Experience truths that Kant refers to usually as truths, and then innate truths. The truths of ethics, the truths of belief, they are innate truths. They cannot be proved or disproved. They are unintelligible, but they are innate truths. And this also brings us to an interesting topic, that in the light of Immanuel Kant, how far can the self be known? Because if the only way of knowing are two, one is the classical way of knowing of sensation, perception, conception, knowledge, the path of what Immanuel Kant says, experience. And the second is innately known truths. And if by neither of them the self can be known, then is there any third way the self can be known? Indian spirituality, mysticism, of course, says there are many other ways the self can be known. Schopenhauer also says knowing the inner world is very different from knowing the outer world. Wittgenstein also says knowing psychology is very different from knowing physics. But within the limits of Immanuel Kant, how far the self can be known? In Immanuel Kant, if we stretch his concepts, we realize there is an unknowable point outside in thinking itself, and there also seems to be an unknowable point inside of about the process of knowing or about the apparatus that knows. And the essential way of knowing the truth in Immanuel Kant is the subject-object truth. There is a subject and there is an object, the thing in itself, and the subject is knowing the object through the process of knowing. But there is no concept in Immanuel Kant about any governing truth or any design in nature. There is a design so far as the process of knowing is concerned, but he does not get into a governing truth like Hegel, where we look at a governing truth, the absolute, that is providing a destination and a direction to history. Or we don't look at a design from a emotional and motivational standpoint of the mind, like Jung proposes or Freud proposes. So the idea of design is limited in Kant's conceptualization to the epistemological process and to the categorical imperative inbuilt. But it does not extend to the concept of a governing truth of history or governing truth even of a human life, the program of life. What would be the program of individuation for an individual? So Kant does not go into those parts. So his truth has this characteristic: knowable, partially knowable, strictly human, but reliable and safe, reliable and stable, truths being experienced and innate truths, and there being limitations on either side of knowing anything completely. In the outside world, the thing in itself cannot be completely known. In the inside world, Kant doesn't say that there is a thing in itself when it comes to the self. But if we stretch Kant's concept, one of the conclusions we can reach would be that. And the nature of subject-object circumstance that Kant takes to be the archetypal circumstance of man interacting with reality, and not saying anything about any historical governing truth or truth governing the individual, or design, the concept of design being extended beyond epistemological process or beyond the categorical. Now, what are the epistemological elementals, the formal categories? I have made this list from a different perspective for creating model of the mind called heat. So I have put here a list of epistemological elementals, which is a combination of what Kant laid out and some more that I have added to it. Now, the question that arises when we take a look at these elementals is, if these are the elementals in terms of which human thinking has to get done, then how far can these elementals be known into themselves? Can we turn one or more of elementals on any particular elemental to know it more? How far can we know space and time? How far can we know substance? Are these elementals fundamental that they cannot be reduced to anything other than themselves? And if so, how far can we apply these elementals to themselves or to other elementals for the process of knowing anything in a more fundamental sense? So this brings us to the very important point in Immanuel Kant, that knowledge can't overlive experience, the process of knowledge. So then the question comes, can we really know space and time? Can we really know causality in its most fundamental sense? And what we realize is, if an elemental turns upon itself, say causality turning upon itself, or space turning, or space, we trying to understand space or time in a more fundamental sense, we find we land up into difficulties. Like if we look at space, we cannot think of a border and we cannot think of an endless space. We think of time, we cannot say it begins somewhere or it ends somewhere. We cannot think of an endless time. We look at causality, you cannot have an effect without a cause, and any cause will be the effect of some other cause, and it's an endless regression. So we get into what Kant would call as sorties, difficulties, irresolvable dilemmas, when we try to get fundamental into some of the elementals. In some elementals, we can at least take one or two steps more fundamental. In some elementals, we just can't move ahead. So elemental turning on oneself or elemental turning on each other not necessarily lead us to a deeper understanding of the elemental. We may have to trust, we may have to treat, we may have to treat some or most of those Kantian elementals as fundamental facts of nature which cannot be reduced to anything other than themselves. And that also creates a limit of our knowing. And here the limit of our knowing comes both from the limits of our apparatus and the limits of the language in terms of which we know. How would we compare Kant's epistemological elementals with Hindu philosophy, elementals in Hindu philosophy? Any mature philosophical system will ultimately try to explain the system in terms of an element, in terms of two elementals. So in Kant, we find the epistemological elementals. And if we look at the Hindu philosophy, we get multiple sets of elementals. And the difference between the two sets of elementals, Kant's elementals and elementals of Hindu philosophy, they come from primarily a difference of focus. Kant is focused essentially on the process of knowing. And Hindu philosophy is focused on the constitution of the human integer, constitution of the universe, and pursuit of enlightenment. And because they come from different places, the elementals each ends up with are very different. Kant's epistemological elementals are also found in Hindu philosophy. So in Hindu philosophy also we have epistemological elements. Some overlap with Immanuel Kant's elementals, some are different. But that set is common to both in a large measure. What is different in Hindu philosophy is that because it views the universe into zones, the physical, the biological or the life zone, the energy zone, the emotional zone, the thought zone or the epistemological zone, the karmic zone, and the pure consciousness zone. Each zone has its elementals, and these elementals interact with each other. So, because Kant did not go into that area of the constitution of the universe or the constitution of the human integer, he did not, otherwise, he could have easily gone into physical elementals and biological elementals apart from the epistemological elementals. But he wanted to do the most fundamental task because he wanted to go into how any elemental can be known and what elementals are involved in knowing any other element. So if we deploy the process of thinking to know the physical elementals, in that very process, the epistemological elementals will be at. In that sense, Immanuel Kant's work is very fundamental. That these epistemological elementals and the process of knowing that Kant talks about will be fundamental to knowing any zone of reality. And in the Hindu philosophy, we have multiple zones like physical, biological, emotional, thought, karmic, and metaphysical, pure consciousness zone. And each zone has its elementals. How do we view Kant's elementals with elementals of physics. Kant would say his elementals are fundamental because they are involved in knowing the elementals of physics. And those in physics would say that the elementals Kant is referring to ultimately are outcomes of some physical process, and therefore it is the physical elementals which are leading to creation of epistemological elementals, which through a process in turn know the physical element. So the physical elementals in the circular route are knowing themselves or facilitating knowing themselves or facilitating themselves getting known, being known. So this is the contest between the physical elementals, physics elementals, and epistemological elementals. And there is this idea of multiple zone elementals, that we may have a set of elementals in physics, a set of elementals in biology, and a set of elementals in psychology. And maybe they are not reducible to anything other than themselves, in which case Kant would have created a set of epistemological elements as fundamental as the physical or biological element. Coming to Jung, there is a very interesting comparison between, not comparison, but cross-referencing one can do. Both Jung and Kant don't believe the mind is tabula rasa. Both believe the mind is innately structured and there is a design at work. Both believe there are innate contents of the mind. For Kant, the contents are categorical imperative limited to ethics. For Jung, it is the collective unconscious archetypes, the self and the program of life. But so Jung uses the idea of design and applies it to mind and the program of life. But neither of them goes to apply the idea of design to the scale of history or talk of any governing elementals. That Kant has left it probably to Hegel. So both of them reject the tabula rasa, both of them believe in innate contents of the mind. Kant limits it to categorical imperative and the process of knowing, does not take the argument of design beyond it. And Jung takes the argument to the structure of the mind, the purpose of the individual, the program of life. Both of them stop a step short of taking the argument of design in the human mind to design in the outer world and thereby design in history. Thank you.